Greetings, everyone. My name is Maristella Auma-Simiyu. I work with the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. Let me start by welcoming you all to our discussion on government responses to disinformation in Africa and its impact on freedom of expression. Just to give you a bit of a background, this is actually part of a series of discussions on disinformation under the lens of a tracker that was developed as part of a collaborative effort between different civil society organizations. Formerly, this tracker was known as the Disinformation Tracker, but the tool was recently updated and launched under the name Lexota, which stands for Laws on Expression, Online Tracker and Analysis. Conceptually, disinformation is false, inaccurate, or misleading information that is created and shared with the intention to cause harm. In this discussion, we'll be taking a keen focus on the findings under Lexota, looking at specific examples from Francophone countries and Lusophone countries that were not really adequately covered in the previous discussions. We'll also be looking at insights from some Anglophone countries that came up in the updating of this particular tool. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our speakers for today to introduce themselves, and I will start with you, Jackie. I will hand the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Maristella, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our listeners. I'm really honored to be here today having this discussion. My name is Jacqueline Rowe, or Jackie, and I am a policy officer with an organization called Global Partners Digital. And the organization is based in London, and we work on a number of digital rights and digital policy issues. And my kind of particular focus is on online contents and platform regulations and content restrictions around content types like disinformation or hate speech or terrorist content. And it's been great to work with the Center for Human Rights on the updating of the Lexota tool. And I'll hand over to Dercio to introduce himself.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Maristella, for your introduction. My name is Dercio Tanzana, and I'm working as research assistant at the Center for Human Rights. And I'm from Mozambique. My interest as researcher, it's about digital rights and political participation in Lusophone countries. For me, it's a pleasure to be here today with you, and also to be part of this great project, which we will be discussing in the next few minutes. And thank you.
Thank you very much, my speakers. I am very happy to be moderating this particular discussion. And I know for sure, because I have worked with them, that they are a very distinguished panel. Let me call them panel. So let me start with you, Jackie. I know I mentioned Lexota in the introduction, but what is Lexota? Give us a snippet, a snapshot on what Lexota is.
Yes, thanks, Maristella. I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see the visuals right now. Because when we're talking about Lexota, then I thought it would be good to actually show some of our listeners what this tool is and what it's about and what it can be used for. So we see you have it's just lexota.org. It's very easy to find online. And the main point of the tool is to track and to analyze any policies or laws or government actions or law enforcement actions taken with relation to disinformation across all countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So you see that the scope of the map is here if you go to the Browse Map page. And we've analyzed 5 kind of categories of these laws and policies and actions. We have some countries which have produced specific legislation specifically targeting disinformation. We have a lot of countries that have included restrictions on disinformation in more general speech-related legislation. So sometimes that's penal codes, or sometimes that's Cybercrimes Act, or cybersecurity acts. So an awful lot of countries in the region have some kind of restrictions in that vein. We also have some countries that are proposing legislation, and a number of countries that have taken some kind of law enforcement action, whether that's arrests or journalist intimidation. And then we also have a few countries that have applied some kind of government pressure, which maybe isn't strictly law enforcement, but might be public statements or warnings to media outlets, or warnings about COVID-19 disinformation, for example. So here in this Browse Map page, we get a really useful overview of the sorts of actions that are going on in each country. But when we analyze each of these laws, we're not just noting that these laws are there, we're also actually providing a kind of comparative analysis of the laws that are in each different country. And to show you what I mean by this, I'm just going to go to the kind of comparison page. And if we compare laws in all countries, just for now, you can see that for each country, we have a link to the relevant laws. We note, which type that law is. And then for each law, we have analyzed it according to this kind of 6-question framework, which is basically designed to assess whether the restrictions on disinformation are in alignment with international human rights law and relevant standards. So many of our listeners today will be very familiar with the kind of 3-part test for permissible restrictions on freedom of expression. And these questions basically allow us to assess whether these laws are meeting that 3-part test. So we have a question: is there clarity over the scope of the law? Is speech or content, is the disinformation restricted only in pursuit of a legitimate aim? Are there exemptions where an individual might be sharing the disinformation without realizing that it's disinformation? Who's deciding what counts as disinformation? Is that left to an independent, authority like a court or another judicial authority, or is it a government agency or some kind of government body, which may obviously have political motivations for determining that something is fake news or is disinformation? And then we also have a question on the proportionality of any penalties or sanctions, and whether intermediaries, so online platforms like Meta or Twitter, whether these companies are also held responsible for disinformation, which, as we've seen, when the answer is yes, it often leads to over censorship by those companies. So this is just a whistle-stop tour of how we analyze the laws. We have a similar kind of question framework for law enforcement actions and government pressure. So, for example, for arrests or for charging of individuals, then we have a similar set of questions, although adapted slightly, given that these aren't laws, they are actions. One thing I wanted to raise is that obviously when we ask this question about the laws, are any responses or sanctions proportionate? Sometimes we can't actually tell from the law or policy itself. There might be a wide range of possible responses, or it might be unclear just from the text of the law how it will be applied. And so that's why it's really useful to also have in Lexota all of this data about law enforcement actions or government actions taken under some of these laws, including restrictions, because then we can see really how the law is being applied in practice, and that's relevant to our understanding of whether the law meets international human rights law and standards. The last thing I will say is obviously this kind of view and the map view provide a snapshot of what the state is like across the region, what the temperature check is in a particular country, but we do also include a lot more detailed information on each of the country profiles. So let's say you're a researcher and you're researching some of these laws or incidents in Cameroon. You can click on Cameroon and we have a much more detailed profile with a kind of introduction and a top level overview of the state of play in that country. And then we have each of the laws and law enforcement actions or incidents of government pressure that we've recorded in Lexota, and you can drill down into each of those categories, and you can see our full answer to each of those questions that I was just talking about using the table view. And here we specify exactly which section or which article includes the restriction on disinformation. And we go into much more detail about the assessment of how we would interpret that article against the 3-part test for permissible restrictions on freedom of expression. So there's a lot of detail in the tracker. There's a lot of data. We've tried to curate it in ways which will be useful both for those wanting an overall snapshot or to look at overall trends across the region or across a country, but also this very granular detail on each law or each relevant provision as well. So it's our hope that Lexota, as it grows and continues, will become a really useful tool for researchers or human rights defenders, both in the region and outside of the region, working on these issues. And we hope it's a repository of useful information and analysis for those individuals. I'll pass back to Maristella, who I think will take us on to the next part of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jackie. I see at least you've given us a sort of step-by-step guide on what to look for when we are navigating this particular tool. And I believe anyone who has just watched your presentation right now can easily navigate the Lexota tool to get whatever information that they need. And so with that, let us jump into the discussion about the findings. Thank you very much, Jackie, for that. Let's jump into the discussion for the findings, and I will bring in Dacio here. When we look at Lexota, from a Lexota perspective, we know we have said it's about trends when it comes to how government responds to disinformation. What did we find in terms of legal responses to disinformation, especially looking at the context of Lusophone and Francophone countries in Africa? Over to you, Dacio.
Thank you, Maristella, and thank you, Jackie, for your great introduction. The first point which we discussed when we analyzed many legislation in different countries, not only in Lusophone or even in Francophone countries. The first question which we can find is we have many types to define disinformation. We have different ways to understand what do we mean about disinformation. I remember that, Maristella, you gave us a definition in the beginning, but sometimes it's not easy to understand even what do we mean about disinformation. As you can see when Jackie showed us the platform, many countries don't have a legislation on disinformation. What we have is general legislation sometimes. What we can find is countries using penal codes or maybe using local legislation just to say we fight against disinformation, but it's not easy to understand what we are talking about. The second point which we can underline as our finding is that many countries use different legislation not to fight against disinformation, but sometimes to fight against activists or even to fight against people who want to speak or want to ask or want to discuss about access to information, but also freedom of expression. I can give you maybe two examples. The first, it's about Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau is a Lusophone country, which we don't have legislation to counter disinformation today. However, we can find laws like penal code and also press law, which they use to fight or maybe to go against activists. For example, using a penal code from Guinea-Bissau, we can find rules like this law must prevent preparation of war or must prevent preparation against people who would like maybe to disturb a public order. But what do we mean about public order and on penal code? It's not easy to understand this kind of expression. Another point regarding to Guinea-Bissau is legislation about press law. We have this law since 1991, but until today, this law, they just use it to fight against people who may create press crimes. But it's not easy to understand what do we mean about press crimes. And this country has been using this law just not to fight against disinformation, but maybe to create an environment where people don't speak and they don't ask, because the government can use different ways to prevent people speaking or saying something about what's happening in the country. The other aspects which we could find during our research is about Francophone countries. We didn't find many countries with legislation about disinformation. And I can cite maybe some examples from Burkina Faso and Senegal, which are countries, they are trying to propose a bill or maybe to propose a legislation on disinformation. One of these countries, which I would like to underline, is Senegal. Senegal, they have now a proposal against disinformation. It's not discussed in the parliament, but they're still discussing about it. But we can find some examples of countries, they are trying to propose something to discuss about disinformation. But today, Senegal, they have a bill which they call Bill on the framework of the use of social networks. When we look to this bill, it's not easy to understand the scope. For example, we can find articles which mention words like rumors. We can mention words like organizing a war, or maybe organizing protest, or maybe demonstration, but it's not easy to understand which is the scope of this law. The second aspect, which we think that it's important to understand here, it's about prohibition, for example. This legislation, they don't have a clear scope about the time, or even about the fees which people must pay when they are arrested by a police or by judicial authorities. So we can find some countries' proposal, but we still lack of clarity, but also about what do we mean about disinformation. Sometimes we find in the same law words like fake news or maybe misinformation. So we still have much to do to understand this legislation in these countries.
Thank you very much for that, Dacio. And from your presentation just right now, I get a sense that when we look at the framing of these laws, there's a challenge when it comes to the framing of the law and the clarity of these laws. You have given at least an idea of how these laws, what these laws are, but can you talk more about how they are being enforced?
So what we can see today in many countries is that people can talk on social media, or journalists can just publish reports. And what they do, many governments, they try to use this legislation, but sometimes they use it and don't explain why we arrest someone, for example. They do it after the arrest, or after when, for example, organizations like freedom of expression entities, or maybe local organization, they ask, why do you arrest these people? And they say, no, we arrest him because he said something which is not true, but show us which laws do you use to arrest these people. And sometimes we don't find legislation regarding to arrest of people. I can give you some examples. For example, in Angola last year, we had the government, they used legislation to arrest people who was doing protests against legislation on municipal elections. They said, for example, activist whose name is Luati Beirão, he was recording videos during the manifestation, and he was recording it just to put it on Facebook. And the government arrested him and said, oh, this is not true. But when we asked it as activists, when we asked him as local organization, the government don't show which law they use it. But we have other examples which we can say that, no, this government, they really use legislation to arrest people because they publish fake news or they publish disinformation. I can give you one example from Uganda. For example, July 2021, it was arrested activist whose name is called Jamilo Sekondwa. He was arrested and he was charged for 4 days because he spread false or offensive communication. And the government used legislation to arrest this kind of people who can publish disinformation. But once again, even if the government arrests people, we have the second part of discussion, which is not clear. For example, when we ask about legitimate aim, it's not easy to understand why the government arrests people without a legitimate aim. And the second aspect, it's about fees. Once again, you can't say it's someone who must pay, for example, fees which are not proportionate. And sometimes government use it not to arrest people because they did something, but just to abuse, in our point of view, right? And also just to say that you are activist, you act against government, so you must be arrested. And this is some example we can find not only in Uganda, but also we have examples from São Tomé and Príncipe, and also in Mali, we had some examples in 2020, and even in Mozambique. Today, Mozambique, we don't have legislation on disinformation, but we have a proposal about it. And the civil organization is still discussing because we have some parts which are not clear to understand why government create legislation now in Mozambique, even the time is not good to create this kind of legislation. For example, Mozambique today, we are facing terrorism. So what government created legislation in the time of conflict, in the time of terrorism. We can see that they created it just to prevent people speaking about conflict and maybe media not to report about conflict. So we have many strategies which government use to prevent people and also to abuse against freedom of expression and also access to information.
Thank you for that, Dacio. Thank you very much for that, because listening to you when you talk about the findings on government responses, it really goes, you've gone into what we discuss in the limitations of rights. We talk about freedom of expression here, that's the theme of the right that is of focus here, but we know freedom of expression is not an absolute right. It is subject to limitations. But when we look at international law, we know that the limitation should meet a particular test, that when you talk about the laws need to be clear. For example, it should be provided by a law, but the laws need to be clear, and we see challenges in that regard. You've talked about legitimate aim. What is the legitimate aim being pursued by particular laws? For some of the laws you've mentioned, yes, there's this sort of a nebulous connection when it comes to the legitimate aim, but it's also not clear, and it's not explained enough for the ordinary citizen to know what is this particular legitimate aim that this law is pursuing. And something else you've mentioned is the issue of proportionality. For example, with the sanctions, how are the sanctions? Are they proportional? And we've seen in certain circumstances that it fails to meet this test. And so what we are getting from some of the examples that you've given us, that when these laws are examined, in accordance with whether they're in accordance with international laws and standards, to some extent they do fall short. And this will bring me to my next question in terms of, given the challenges that we see here, what could be the direct or indirect consequences of these government responses? But maybe I should start with Jackie to give you a bit of break here. Let me go to Jackie. In terms of the consequences that we are seeing from these government responses, what would you have to say?
Yeah, thanks, Maristella. I mean, yeah, the picture that Dacio has painted, I think shows that first and foremost, like if individuals are being arrested for sharing disinformation without legitimate aim or under a law that isn't clear, then their human rights are being violated, you know. So we've seen some of the examples that we included in Lexota of arrests or intimidation. Some people were imprisoned for several months, which is a considerable time, I think maybe even sometimes beyond 1 year. And not always with, as Dacio said, not always with a clear indication of which law the arrest was made under, what they're being charged with, what the aim of the arrest is. And so that's I think the first and foremost most concerning consequence is that individuals are being left in these circumstances. But I would also highlight something which Dacio I think alluded to, that when you have these kind of confusing and harsh criminal restrictions on disinformation, then it can also contribute to self-censorship and have what we'd call a chilling effect on freedom of expression, which is where even if someone isn't actually targeted with the law or isn't actually arrested themselves, they may be fearful of saying what they want to say online because they are unsure of how this might kind of come back to haunt them in the future, or if the wrong person picks up on this post, then they may have police knocking at their door and asking questions. So this kind of chilling effect as well is particularly concerning and very difficult to measure, because if someone is not enjoying the right to express themselves online, you can't compare that to what would be the alternative. You know, there's no test case, there's no baseline in that circumstance, but we know, you know, from speaking to people in the region, from speaking to people in these kind of more repressive environments, that that's a very clear effect of these unclear and disproportionate laws. So those are the two things that I would maybe highlight. Dacio, I don't know if you want to add some more suggestions as well.
Yes, I think that I want just to add one point, and as you mentioned, Jackie, that many governments they do it not to do a legitimate aim, but we have countries where government use it because someone is from opposition, or maybe someone is not part of his clan of political parties, and just use it to prevent people to speak. And I would like to mention another point when we talk about Lusophone countries. What we can see today in many countries from Lusophone is that it's like copy and paste. For example, we have the same kind of expression in utilization for Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. And we don't have specific aspects to understand each country. So sometimes not easy to understand the context, because many legislation, they have the same writing, they have the same perspective. So sometimes it creates difficult to understand what do you mean about this information. And other aspects which I would like to mention regarding to perspective, it's about domestication of the legislation, for example. We know what do we mean sometimes about disinformation, but when you don't speak, when you don't explain people about what do you mean about it, the implementation will be difficult to understand. So this point, I think it's very important also to mention in this discussion.
Thank you very much for that, bringing in the different contexts. That's quite interesting. But given sort of a bleak picture that we have painted here and there, I think we need to see, looking at the stakeholders in this particular area, has there been pushback? What responses are we seeing from activists and stakeholders? And have these responses in any way been impactful? What would you say to that, Dacio? Then we can give to Jackie.
Yeah, I think that many organizations are trying to do something to say we don't agree and we have to change this kind of situation. And I would like to mention the great work which has been doing with you as a partners for this project. Also, you're doing a great job. But I would like to mention the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPG. And we mentioned some examples in Lexota, on Lexota platform. For example, I remember that we have examples from Madagascar. A journalist was arrested. His name is Alfin Helizoa. He was jailed in 2020, if I'm not wrong, because he spread false information, fake news, and disinformation. And CPG, they did a great campaign just to release him and just to publicize and just spread this information for other organizations, what is happening in Madagascar. So this kind of campaign using social media to spread, using hashtags, it can be a way which many stakeholders, they use it just to discuss about activists who are arrested or are not able to speak or to do something. And the impact about this response, sometimes we're dealing with authoritarian regimes, you know, and I can give you an example from Uganda, Rwanda, even sometimes in Mozambique. And this government, they use power to push people back. They use their power to say, no, we are leaving this country, so you can't do anything. We don't have many examples in local countries. What we have is organizations coming abroad, who they did campaign on social media, but locally, we don't find many examples for fighting against this kind of attitudes for our governments. What we have is organizations coming, NGOs and freedom expression organizations, but locally, we still a lack of engagement or maybe working together to fight against what we're facing today in our countries.
Jackie?
Yeah, thank you, Dacio. I think I completely agree with Dacio that we've seen some really effective targeted campaigns run by various organizations, whether that's around a particular law or policy or related to a specific case of an individual who might be detained or experiencing pushback, or a journalist that's being intimidated. So I think those have been super useful. One thing I would add as well is that in some cases we've seen some very effective kind of strategic litigation efforts as well, pushing back against particular provisions in some of these laws that we've mentioned. So, for example, I know that in Zimbabwe, then particular elements of the penal code and also the Law and Order Maintenance Act, then these have actually, particular problematic provisions in those pieces of legislation relating to making false statements or sharing false information online have actually been subsequently struck down, by the courts. And similarly in Kenya, there has been some problematic provisions on disinformation included in the Penal Code and in the Information and Communication Act, which then the courts have then got involved with and have repealed some of those provisions. And I know that one organization, the Bloggers Association of Kenya, is currently going through this process related to some relevant provisions in the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act in Kenya as well. So there are also these strategic litigation efforts, which, depending on the national context and the particular law or particular legislative process, like in some cases, they've also been very effective. And then one other kind of strategy that we've seen as well that I'd highlight would be coordinating kind of coalitions or joint statements. For example, Article 19 in Senegal, I know, has recently coordinated a joint statement by a number of civil society organizations and also by a member of one of the national human rights institutions, sending a joint statement to the government requesting to repeal certain sections of the Penal Code, but in particular the one that includes a restriction on disinformation, a criminal restriction on disinformation. So this can also be a really effective way of kind of gathering momentum behind a particular campaign, is to get buy-in from other national stakeholders and to kind of really demonstrate to the government that people really care about this and that the practice needs to be changed or amended. So yeah, I think those are the two things I would add.
Thank you for that. So what I'm getting here in terms of just giving a summary of it, we have strategic litigation we see happening, we see campaigns happening, we see research happening. There's encouragement for coalitions working together, submitting joint statements for them to be more impactful. This is what we are seeing from stakeholders in the field. And you've mentioned something about context that is very important. You also look at what culture is there in certain countries when it comes to, for example, CSOs working together, or the culture of the media, the culture of CSOs. So that is very important to look at. Just looking at that, those are still very good, at least examples that we got from Lexota. Now let's move on to government, who is often seen as the culprit here in terms of recommendations that you'll give to government towards adopting a more rights-respecting, rights-promoting approach to responding to disinformation. What would you say to government? Do we start with Jackie? Then we can go to Dacio.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maristella. And it's a great question because we don't want to kind of government bash too much in some cases. Then governments are really genuinely concerned about the negative impacts of disinformation, particularly health-based disinformation in COVID-19. In some cases, governments really are trying to protect their citizens and to protect the rights of their citizens, and maybe are introducing these criminal restrictions because that feels like the only thing that will work, or the only thing which will discourage the spread. So I think it's a really important question to say, well, if criminal restrictions are not the right answer, or if intimidation of news outlets and journalists isn't the right answer, then what's an alternative strategy? And I think in this case, we would really encourage governments, first of all, when they are introducing restrictions on particular types of online content, but disinformation in particular, then to be very clear that there has to be intent to cause clear public harm. Someone should never be prosecuted or charged because they shared a satirical joke online, which maybe isn't true or factually accurate, but the point of sharing that piece of information was clearly not to mislead the public, or to mislead someone for financial gain or these other things. So I think one thing that governments can bear in mind is to be very clear about the legitimate aim portion of the restriction on disinformation. And ideally, government responses to disinformation will actually focus not so much on retroactively kind of prosecuting someone that's shared a piece of disinformation, but actually addressing the root causes in the first place and encouraging a healthier information ecosystem before it gets to the point of disinformation going viral. And I would raise here as an interesting example, which is controversial. So I will caveat this by saying that it is a controversial piece of legislation, but we've seen Nigeria just in recent weeks release this draft code of practice for interactive computer service platforms. And this is the NIPDA, the kind of IT regulatory agency for Nigeria, that's come up with this draft code of practice. I'm absolutely not endorsing this code of practice. There are a lot of problems with this piece of legislation, and there's lots in it that we hope that the agency will go away and revise to make it a more rights-respecting piece of legislation. But I do want to highlight that Section 5 of this new code of practice focuses specifically on disinformation. And there are actually some really positive measures included in this problematic piece of legislation. But this section in particular, I found very interesting because the agency is saying things like, you know, to tackle disinformation, platforms should acquaint themselves with indigenous and contextual manifestations causing disinformation in Nigeria. Platforms should collaborate and invest in research with indigenous academics, with local media organizations and journalists, with civil society. Platforms should provide researchers and media organizations with access to data so that those people can research disinformation and how it spreads on the platform. And then it also includes some responsibilities for platforms to collaborate and to organize media literacy programs and to engage fact checkers. And so even though that the general piece of legislation has its issues, I found this section really encouraging, and it seems that NITDA is trying to take a very holistic and multi-stakeholder approach, at least in theory. You know, we obviously have to wait to see how these things happen in practice, but placing responsibility on the platforms to address some of the issues with transparency that prevent people understanding the drivers of disinformation, placing responsibility back on the platforms to amend their business models if their business models or content ranking algorithms are promoting disinformation above more trustworthy sources. So I think that this kind of approach, which includes all the different stakeholders, recognizes the responsibility of platforms and recognizes that sometimes individuals, you know, aren't intending to cause harm or aren't intending to cause any kind of disturbance or anything like that. Sometimes people just don't know what the truth is, or they're sharing a piece of false information without any kind of intention to cause harm. I think these are all elements of a rights-respecting response that government should be implementing.
Thank you very much for that, Jackie. It's good to hear about good practices, even if it's just a section of a law. It's good to hear about good practices we are seeing developing in the continent. Darcy, do you have something to add here?
Yes, I only have some points. First, it's not easy to give a recommendation for the government. And as you know, sometimes they don't listen to us. But I think that we have 3 points which we could mention. Just to add what Jack said, first of all, I think that the government, they have an obligation to protect citizens. This obligation is to give them an opportunity to speak, but also to have access to information. This is an obligation. No one can prevent citizens to speak and to have information. So the government, they have this obligation. The second aspect, it's about, there is no legislation which can be above the Constitution of the Republic. And all the laws must respect the main law. The main law, we are talking about the Constitution. So even we create legislation about disinformation, fake news, using social media networks, no. All the laws must respect what we call the main law. We are talking about Constitution. So the government must respect and also do all to protect that this provision don't go against the Constitution of the Republic or some countries. The other aspect, it's about the government. They must be open to work with civil society organizations. We are talking here about the consortium. We are talking about the network of organizations, but what we see today is the government that they don't want to work with civil society organizations. They don't want to work, they don't want to collaborate. So we think that it's time to collaborate, it's time to be open to work together. And for me, or for us, it could be the recommendation for the government to respect the legislation, to respect our rights, but also be open to work together. I think that it's important for us and as a government, but also as citizens.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you both to Jackie and Dacio for that insights in terms of government responses and what government should do so that their responses are more rights respecting. So we are just about to conclude. But before we conclude, given that we are talking about this particular tool, Lexota, what's next? What's next for Lexota? What is the future for Lexota, the vision of Lexota? I think this I will push to Jackie.
Yes, thanks, Maristella. So as Maristella said at the beginning, we kind of relaunched this tool in May, building on a previous version of the tracker. We want to continue to update and to improve the functionality of the tool so that it's maximally useful for researchers that are using it. So we'll continue to kind of add in new updates, even the code of practice that I was just talking about in Nigeria, we will add these new pieces of legislation, these new proposals, and any new incidents of law enforcement against disinformation. We'll be adding those into the tracker on a quarterly basis and hopefully providing a kind of summary each quarter of some of the changes or new developments that we've seen. We also hope within the next year to do some work and translate the Lexota into French and Portuguese and potentially other relevant languages, because we want it to be as accessible as possible for human rights defenders on the ground in the region. And obviously, at the moment, the tool is just in English. It's sort of the lingua franca, but it would be great to provide those resources as well so that it's as accessible as possible. And I would just highlight as well that there's a section on the website that is like a contact form. We really, really value people's feedback and insights on this. So we're really keen to take in suggestions from how people would like the site to be improved, or if there's information that you are aware of that we haven't included in the tracker. Perhaps you know of someone who has been arrested on charges of false news and we haven't reflected that, then we really rely on this kind of community-powered data to help us understand what's happening on the ground. Obviously, I sit in London and the Center for Human Rights sits in Pretoria in South Africa. And so we really rely on those eyes and ears on the ground to help us keep the tool up to date. So I would just really encourage anyone using the tool to make the most of that function as well. I'll also just highlight that we are hoping to give some sessions at CIPESA's upcoming conference, FIFA Africa. So perhaps we will see some of our listeners there. We'll be presenting again on some of the insights from Lexota and on how to use the tool. And we also have a brief lightning session at the Global Internet Governance Forum in December in Addis. So I'm sure we will see and connect with some of our listeners here today at those forums as well. So back to you, Maricela.
Thank you very much for that, Jackie. Now that we are concluding, maybe I can just give back to Dacio some final thoughts, and then over to you too, Jackie, final thoughts before we bring our discussion to an end.
Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity, Maristella and Jackie, to discuss with you. And just to say, I think that the work is just started. We still have much more to do. And regarding to what you said, Jackie, about translation, to give opportunity for people to have access to Lexota. For example, we are still talking about English, but we have this opportunity to do this work even in Portuguese, or maybe in French. So I think that for the next steps, and we still have this challenge to do. And the other aspect, it's about, we did something, we started work. Even if the government don't listen to us, even if they don't change the practice, but we have something to present. And I think that Lexota is this kind of result. Now we can say, look to Lexota, we can discuss with something which is practice and it existed. So let's be motivated and say Lexota, it's starting for maybe other steps of this work on disinformation and access to information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jackie, any last thoughts?
Nothing profound to add, just to thank everyone for having me. And yeah, we really hope that the tool will be a useful kind of foundation for future work, future research, future advocacy efforts, and we hope it will provide the information that people need in order to push back against some of these problematic restrictions. So it's been wonderful to work with you both on this project so far, and I'm excited to see the next steps as well.
Thank you very much, the discussants. I really reiterate and echo everything that you've mentioned throughout this discussion, and also your concluding thoughts. I do echo them. And we have mentioned Lexota through it all, remembering that Lexota means laws on expression, online track and analysis. And here, the GCI is about expression. Often we say freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy, and it really is no lie. Particularly when you look at elections, when we look at how democratic development is happening in different countries, freedom of expression is indeed a cornerstone of all of these. And it's very unfortunate sometimes when we see regulations and responses that we see that are not rights respecting. And this is, I believe, an inspiration behind a lot of the work that we are doing with Lexota. And I do again echo the words in terms of calling on to stakeholders to use this particular tool, and really hope indeed that it will be useful in your work. With that, I'll bring our discussion to an end and thank my discussants again. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.